Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to the Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on most of the major podcast platforms, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, the Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. Our guest today is Dr. Sundhya Walther. Dr. Walther is a Presidential Fellow in English at the University of Manchester in the UK. She is also the author of the recent book, Multispecies, Modernity, Disorderly Life in Postcolonial Literature. The title examines relationships and interactions between humans and animals in the context of post-colonial India. This time and place configuration is important because it situates Dr. Walther's work in a context that is very different than the early years of animal studies research, which derived from a Western philosophical lineage. During this four-part series, we'll explore a range of topics from Dr. Walther's book, including how post-colonial India context advances the study of human and animal interaction, Hindu nationalism's influence on India's relationship with the natural world, and why modern life isn't as orderly and manufactured as we like to think it is. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this third episode, Dr. Walther discusses some of the structural as well as thematic elements of her book, including her focus on Hindu-influenced texts, why she highlights mammals of a charismatic nature, and why each chapter ends with a section that provokes further thought through depictions of visual art. In your book, you focus on Hindu-influenced texts, and this seems to be an act of sort of simplifying how animals are represented in literature. And I think by simplifying, I mean like you're sort of, I guess, contextualizing this in a certain way. And can you then expand on your interest in and the importance of the Hindu India context?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, as your audience probably knows, the rise or the mainstreaming of Hindu nationalism since 2016 in India is and has been a very disturbing and dangerous phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the conception of Hinduism as inhabiting a particular kind of virtue with respect to non-human animals has been very much central to that, right? So we have the case of gorakshaks or cow vigilante killings, right, where people who are ethnic or caste minorities, so Dalits and Muslims primarily, minority populations, are targeted as the killers of cows, right? The so-called killers of cows. And the BJP regime is very invested in constructing the cow as this figure that needs to be protected, right? So that this vigilante violence becomes a kind of purging of violence, a different kind of violence from the nation. So they enact violence in order to prevent violence. Is the ideology, right? So this is one sort of arm of my interest in Hinduism, as those kinds of ideas of what the nation of India is, the idea of the nation of India as a Hindu nation,
Mm-hmm.
become increasingly mainstream. And the other thing is that I think in the West, the idea of India as a Hindu nation is kind of taken as a given in a way that it never has been in India. And there are certain ideas in animal studies and outside of what Hinduism represents with respect to the non human. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
most dominant ideas, for example, is ahimsa or non harming. And we see this in everything from sort of the marketing of yoga to in animal studies texts, this idea that Hinduism is somehow a religion that promotes a peaceful relationship with animals, which is not historically true,
Hmm.
nor is it a sort of real understanding of Hinduism, but it's a very prevalent idea, right? So when animal studies texts, earlier ones, sort of mention contexts outside of the West, it tends to be this idea that oh, in Hinduism, the, people don't eat meat, which also has never been true. But so this is an example of how, other cultures do it, right?
Right.
Whereas, as opposed to carnivorousness in the West.
Hmm.
And the final thing I'd say about that is that makes it an interesting example is that Hinduism does privilege the non-harming of animals ideologically rather than materially as a virtue. And so things like vegetarianism become associated with oppression, right? With caste hierarchy and with the abuse of minorities, which is very different from the context in the West where meat is associated with power. And this is sort of one of the major tropes of animal studies that I wanted to see how it would function if the reverse were true, if we couldn't make an argument about vegetarianism being democratic or egalitarian,
Hmm.
if in fact it might be a very ethically problematic position to take. So those are some of the reasons that I chose to focus on Hindu inflected texts.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. Okay. Um, so your book focuses on mammals, and particularly, as you say, those of a quote charismatic nature. For example, tigers, leopards, and as we talked about, monkeys. How do these species? Why this focus on that grouping?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a limitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a limitation in scope because I could have talked about bacteria, I could have talked about
Right.
fish, I could have talked about viruses, birds, and each of those focuses or a mix of them would have given another sort of rich set of readings.
Right. So it would have been a
So
long book.
a series maybe rather
Yeah.
than
Right.
than one. Um, so the reason that I chose these animals is partly because they tend to come up a lot in the
Mm,
literature.
right.
They tend to be associated with India, right? So cows, tigers, monkeys. Um, these are animals that are associated with India, within India and outside of it, right? So
Hmm.
we can think of, I don't know, monkey thieves on Animal Planet, right? Which followed these monkeys in Jaipur, sort of doing kind of Robin Hood monkey things, stealing
Right.
things and breaking into houses and fighting. Um, so so these are sort of ways that India is conceptualized, both domestically and globally, through these animal figures. And another thing is that these charismatic mammals have been politically important in India. So Project Tiger, or the Tiger Conservation Authority in India, was absolutely central to the idea of India as an independent nation, a united nation where a nation didn't really exist before, of this diversity of languages and peoples and religions, um, and a nation that would step onto the world stage as an independent political body and be able to lead, right? To lead on the conservation of tigers. Absolutely central to the Indira Gandhi government. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Conservationists in India, I mean, some of them that I've spoken to still see her as a hero, right? As the one of the best political leaders they've ever had, despite the horrendous injustices practiced on human beings under her leadership. So it was these sorts of investments, symbolic and political investments that I want to trace through looking at these kind of iconic mammals of India.
Mhm. Okay, perfect. So you point out that one of your intentions with the book is to quote open up a kind of post-colonial freedom for non-human animals as well, even as their bodies and habitats are increasingly colonialized. I'm wondering if you can expand on that thought. I mean, what do you mean by quote post-colonial freedom for non-humans in particular, and how is your book depicting this?
Mhm. So that's a phrase that I borrow from the anthropologist Anand Pandian. And he writes about the ways in which the particular subjects of his field research inhabit their animality, is the word he says. So the way that their particular caste and a lower caste in the caste hierarchy, um, and they're often conceived of as criminal, which is a criminal caste, which is an old categorization that I can't really define here, but suffice to say, there's a certain idea of who they are,
Hmm.
and so he argues that they're often conceived of in these animal terms or associated with animality in certain ways. And sometimes, instead of resisting that, they choose to inhabit that as a kind of power, right?
Hmm.
But in his idea, because of what he's writing about, he doesn't necessarily think about what that does to or for the animal, right? So those human
Right.
beings inhabit their animality and in doing so achieve a kind of post-colonial freedom, a freedom from the ideas of who they are that are imposed upon them by power.
Hmm.
So I want to think about in what ways animals, despite being subject to power in every way, uh, can find a kind of post colonial freedom, right? Can make a sort of resistance. So I want to look at instances where animals are disturbing, right? Where they disturb the kinds of discourses that set out to define them or put them in place or categorize them as certain kinds of animal, um, where they might create kinds of disorder that,
Hmm.
even fleetingly or even only fictionally can allow a kind of freedom from that power, right? That
Right.
colonization.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so you use a pretty fascinating technique in the sort of the structure of your book, and each of the chapters end with a provocation, which
Mm.
is intended to be a brief sort of interstitial that takes a step back to reconsider that chapter while segueing into the next. The consideration here, though, is achieved through a focus on visual art, and I thought that was really cool. Can you describe these sections more and how you intended them to function in the book?
Yeah. So these sort of arose out of wonderful opportunities that I had to speak to these artists. And the three artists I spoke to were Sujatra Ghosh, Sakshi Gupta, and Jagannath Panda, who also very kindly allowed me to use one of his paintings for the cover
Hmm.
of the book. Um, and all of them are interested in representing animals in their visual art for very different reasons in very different ways, um, and with really different i- ways of thinking about how the animal is a presence in their
Hmm.
work, right?
Hmm.
um, and this really interested me, and so I was able to speak with each of them at some length about how they think about animals and what they're sort of doing with those figures in their work. So I wanted to think about visual art. And as I said, I write about all kinds of things in the book, but I
Right.
chose to focus these provocations on visual art. For one thing, because I wanted to sort of interrupt the structure of the book. And I think that these provocations offer a kind of disturbance in the sort of logical structure that allows the reader to think about where we've just been, think about where we're going,
Hmm.
think about, what kinds of other connections might be possible, and just sort
Yeah.
of pause in that kind of linearity, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I also intended them as so sort of a brief respite from the sort of structured nature of the book,
Yeah.
for the eyes too, because you get to
Hmm.
see the art, for the type of analysis, and also thinking about visual art itself as something that creates space for new formations, right? For
Hmm.
new ways of living, um, and in this case, it's spaces that we can see on the page, right? So it's sort of a different way of engaging with the text for analysis, from looking at written text, for
Right.
example. So that
Right.
was my intention, really, to as interruption, as a space for reflection,
Yeah.
as a kind of break.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Mhm.
Definitely a recurring theme of disruption in your work, it
Yes,
seems like.
yeah, exactly.
You just heard from Dr. Sundhya Walther, a presidential fellow in English at the University of Manchester and author of the recent book, Multispecies, Modernity, Disorderly Life in Postcolonial Literature. Next week is the final discussion of this series, and it also happens to be our 300th episode. That's crazy, right? It's crazy. That's a lot of episodes. Join us as we discuss the many intersections of Dr. Walther's research, how she sees the field of animal studies evolving, and why it's so important for scholars to maintain an ethical approach to their research.
It's connected, obviously, to the lived experience of exploitation that occurs across the world, of the exploitation and violence against non-human animals and against subaltern peoples, that is always, or should always be, at the forefront of work in these fields, right? At the forefront of our minds as scholars of postcolonial studies and animal studies, and ever present in our work, right? That our work is a political commitment, is an ethical commitment. Um, to me, that's absolutely central. And I don't see how you could practice in these fields without having a politics, without having an ethical approach, or thinking through what is your ethical approach to these questions.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.